Welcome to the November Intuity Tech Talk. I'm John Diamond, the product manager at Intuity, and also with me today is my colleague Larry Balon, who's a system engineer at Intuity. We'll be your hosts for the next 45 minutes or so. Tech Talks, as most of you know, are designed for our customers and technical members of our authorized partner community. These sessions are recorded and are available on demand from the Intuity YouTube Center. They're a good resource for learning more about the product or reviewing features you may be interested in implementing. A few housekeeping items before we get into today's content. The call is on mute mode to eliminate any outside noise. Feel free to ask questions at any time via the chat panel. We will have time at the end to take questions that have been posted. So, let's get started. Today, we'll be using Intuity 16.5 Patch 2. By the way, if you have questions on this release, please don't hesitate to contact your Intuity system engineer. We're more than happy to discuss the new content, from the BMC dashboard integration to all of the new enhancements that make monitoring your network more efficient and effective. The subject at hand for this Tech Talk is Intuity Configuration Management. As you probably know, it automates the execution of command line operations that are performed on managed devices. Using configuration management's extensive features will streamline your workflow, automate mundane tasks, and deliver accurate data. Operations can be in the context of a device or port, allowing you to have one operation performed on a device or port, or, and this is where the labor-saving benefits really kick in, per device or port for all the devices or ports in a view. Finally, let me point out that although the main purpose of the configuration management scripts is to automate command line communications, it provides a general purpose scripting platform. These scripts are launched under the control of tasks, either by a user from a device, port, or view context menu, or under the control of a scheduler. There's also a way to launch a task from an event management system action, which was explained in the June 2017 Tech Talk. Today, we're going to be running through 4 different examples of using the configuration management capability. First, my colleague Larry is going to explain how to remove an infected host from the network. Then he'll show how a port can be assigned to a VLAN on a switch. Then I'll show how the configuration of routers can be automated to insert a NetFlow export configuration. And finally, I'll show a twist on the use of configuration management in that it can be used to populate an attribute on a device using a command line request instead of SNMP. So, with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who will be able to show you how we can remove an infected host from the network. So here we go, Larry.
Thank you, JD. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Larry Balon. I am a system engineer based out of the Boston, Massachusetts area, and I'll be conducting the first part of our demo today. So I'm going to share out my screen and go to the system that I have up and running. So before we get into the actual demonstration of removing the infected host and assigning a VLAN to a port, I'd just like to do a very brief refresher on the configuration management module. So the configuration management module is it's a module that's part of the standard Intuity software. When you install the software, it's turned off by default. So it has to be turned on through the configure utility. And I'm at the license health screen here, and you can see here my configuration management module is indeed turned on. If that says no, you just need to stop the Intuity server, rerun the configure command, and enable that module. So I'll go to the configuration management area of our interface, and you'll see here when you bring up the page, it will bring up a history. If this was a new installation, you wouldn't have any history. We've already run the demo before, and this is just a list of previous tasks that have been executed. There are 3 tabs in the configuration management web page. There's a Tasks tab, there's a Steps tab, and there's a Schedules tab. We're not going to cover the Schedules tab today, but you can create tasks to be run on a scheduled basis. So a task consists of steps, and a step is basically a script that runs a set of commands. And I'll bring up the Steps tab, and you'll see here that there's a category. All of the steps, with the exception of one, which says Remove VLAN Assignment, are the ones that ship with the product, and they're designed not to be changed because if you upgrade the software, will overwrite the system tasks if we allowed you to modify those. But there is a copy command that allows you to copy these steps, and the steps consist of an expect script. So if I were to bring up the step for the port down and view it, you'll see here that there is a test to look to see if the vendor equals 9, and that's the vendor OID for Cisco. So this particular step is designed to run against Cisco systems. You can obviously write additional scripting that works with other vendors. And here, there's some variables that are set, and basically it's going to send the configure terminal command to bring the system into the terminal for configuring, and then it's going to send the interface, the port identifier, and it's going to shut it down. If I go to the tasks again consist of specific steps. You'll see here most of these are system tasks, and the same rules apply. Anything that's labeled as a system task cannot be modified, but it can be copied, and then you can create new tasks from that. I'll bring up the port down task, and we'll view that, and you'll see here that it consists of 3 steps. So there's a step to log into the network device. There's a step to execute the command to bring the port administratively down, and then there's a 3rd step that will log us out of the device. There's a context field, and the context can be set for the port or the device. And then in the Advanced tab, you can set this to raise an event when it's completed, and you can also set these tasks to show up on the context menu. And one thing that does have to be done, again, prior to actually using the management module, and I neglected to say that at the beginning, I'll go to the inventory page, is that you actually have to configure the device to enable CLI access. So I'll just pick a Cisco device here. When the devices are added to inventory for SNMP polling purposes, the command line parameters are not configured. You simply modify the device, and the 3rd set of parameters here are for CLI access. So you set the method, which you can set to either SSH or Telnet. You can leave the port field blank if you're using the standard SSH and Telnet ports, and then you can provide a username and up to 2 passwords. For Cisco devices, in order to modify the configuration, there's typically a second enable password. Those can be all put in here, and then saved. The credentials are encrypted when they're saved to the Intuity database, and once you've set the CLI access for the device, you can then take advantage of the configuration management module. So the first thing that we're going to demonstrate is how to set a port to a downstate. And so in this use case is one where the security team has located a device that they believe is infected and is causing problems in the network. It's a computer device, and it's attached to a switch in our network. So if you get the call at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can actually get into the system here and run this without having to enter any of the specific commands. So how do we find that? Well, we're going to use the search tool. So the security team has provided us with a name of the device that's acting up, and we'll simply put that in the search box, and that you'll see here that when we put the generic term in the search box, it'll bring up every instance where this particular name shows up in the database. So there are a number of network ports or network interfaces on the server that show up, but we're actually looking for the switch, which is down at the bottom here, and more specifically, we're looking for the port that device is connected to. So if I select the port and right-click, I have a number of options here. If I wanted to launch the Explorer tool, I could do that, and it will take me over to the device. But you can see here that the configuration management selection is displayed. So I can execute the command directly from here, which is what we're going to do in a minute. So just an additional word about the configuration management module. It's fully permissionable, meaning that you can create groups of users, and you can assign those groups of users access to specific configuration management tasks. So you can create a large number of tasks and then permission them appropriately depending on who in the staff in your organization needs access to those commands. So we're going to execute the port down command. I'm going to take this port out of service. The job gets submitted. If I want to look at the status, I can simply click here. This will bring me to the configuration management history page, and this job has already succeeded. If I'd gotten there a little bit sooner, the status would have said in progress, and then the web page will automatically update once the status of that job changes. So we'll go to the Explorer. We'll locate the port that we just set to an administratively down state, and I'll click the icon here, and that's just going to bring up the live status, and it will go query that device, and you can see that indeed the port is down. If we wait a little bit longer, that'll actually turn blue to indicate that it's administratively down. The second task that we're going to do is to assign a VLAN to a specific port on the switch. I'll come back to the configuration management, and I'll bring up the task bar, and this port VLAN task is the one that assigns a port to a specified VLAN. So we'll bring up the steps. So in this case, what we've done, basically similar to the last task that we executed, there are 3 steps. We log into the device, we execute the script that's associated here with the port VLAN step, which is going to assign a VLAN to a specific port, and then we log out. But we've added a parameter here called VLAN number. So what this is going to do, it's going to prompt the user for input. So it's a little pop-up box that's going to show up and ask for input, and it's going to utilize that input to execute the step. So I'll go back to the device we were working on previously, And again, I'm going to utilize the same port on the switch. And again, if I right-click, we'll go to Configuration Management. We'll select the port VLAN task, and you can see here a little pop-up box asks us for input, and we're going to assign this to 201. And we'll click OK. We'll go back to the job history page. You can see it's in progress right now. And we'll just wait in a couple of seconds because this is a fairly simple task. This will update, and it's succeeded. And we will just double check that. We'll select the switch, and I'll open up a remote terminal session with the switch. And we'll just check the status of the interfaces. And if we look at FA021, you can see now that that is assigned to VLAN 201. So the task was successfully completed. And with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass control over to JD, and he will cover the next two configuration management tasks.
Great, thank you very much, Larry. We're going to move on to the third of the examples today, and that's going to be where we're going to automate configuring, in this case, Cisco routers to export NetFlow records back to the Intuity server so that we can do flow reporting on them. Now, this involves setting up some configuration per device and also some additional configuration per interface on those devices. If you've got 100 interfaces on your router, that means that you've got a lot of work to do. So this is a way of automating that to take the drudgery out of it, but also mean that you can avoid typos. So furthermore, there's a great benefit here that if you've got a bunch of routers that need this type of configuring, then you can do them all in one operation. If you just put them all into a view, or select them, do a multi-select on a bunch of these routers from an existing view, you would be able to run the configuration task that I'm about to show you all together rather than running them one by one. It's a massive time saver. So I mentioned that there's some device-level configuration and some port-level configuration. I'm going to break this out into two separate configuration tasks. One of them is going to focus on the device-level config lines, and the other one is going to do the per interface lines. So let's go in and take a look at the device-level configuration first. So I'm into configuration management, and I'll just show you the tasks that are associated with this. The tasks themselves look very similar to the ones that Larry showed you. First of all, the one that's going to operate at the device level, let me show you how that's configured. It logs in, it calls a step script that I'm going to show you in a moment. It actually does the work, and then it logs out. But it is going to ask you for the IP address of the Intuity server that the flow records are going to have to be sent back to. Now, there's a twist on this one, and that is that I've got support for zone configurations in here as well. Now, that's our support for having overlapping IP address spaces where we can set up a zone, define the IP address of the network interface that all of the communications for devices within that zone are going to use, and then assign devices to a zone. That means that we can steer traffic to and from the Intuity server and the devices under management differently for different zones. And typically, this would be of great use to a managed service provider who is having to support multiple customers from the same server, but they've got overlapping IP address spaces. They're sharing the same IP address ranges. Now, one of the benefits of zone configuration is that the IP address that the devices are going to have to talk back to talk to the Intuity server is unambiguous. You've specified it, and it is a specific IP address. When you've got an ordinary configuration where you're not using a zone configuration, your server might actually have multiple different IP addresses. In fact, even my laptop here that I'm using has got 3 different interfaces. I've got one for the hardwired Ethernet, one for the Wi-Fi, and one for a VPN interface. And so there's 3 IP addresses, so it's ambiguous. So under those circumstances, I would need to tell it which IP address I actually want the devices to send their flow records back to. But to begin with, it's going to put the word zone, just as a string, into this parameter, and that will indicate that it should look it up automatically from the zone configuration. But it does allow me to then punch an IP address in specifically when I run the task if I want to run without zones and give it an IP address. As far as the advanced configuration, I'm telling it to check that this is in fact a Cisco device. It's checking that the vendor number is 9 and only run it if it's Cisco. But I've also enabled the show on view selection, which means that the context menu, that's the right-click menu for a view, will show this configuration task, provided the user has permission to access it. I've increased the selection limit from the default of 1 to 500. That means that if you've got a view with a bunch of devices in it, you can select more than one and still have access to this task. I'll show you quickly what the port configuration looks like, and that's fairly similar. Again, we log in, we execute a port step for flow exporting, and then we log out again. Looking at the advanced thing here, the only real difference is that I've extended the filter so that not only does it check that it is a Cisco device, but it also insists upon it being a physical port. So it checks this attribute called the port virtual indicator to make sure that it is 0, which means it is not virtual. That's because we discover both physical and virtual interfaces on devices, and those virtual interfaces don't all exist within the configuration file. And if you try and put a flow export configuration into part of the config that doesn't exist, then you'll get a failure. Okay, let's move on to the steps. How do we go about this? So I'm going to find the device step here for setting up the device level configuration. And what that does is, first of all, it looks at that server IP address field that I was telling you about earlier. If it contains the word zone, then it automatically looks up the IP address of the network interface that device is configured to use by virtue of its zone membership. Alternatively, if it doesn't contain the word zone, it assumes that it is in fact an IP address that I've punched in when running the task, and it will use that IP address. Then we move on to the expect operation. This is the automation of the command line communication. First of all, checks to make sure that it is a Cisco device. It won't run this if it's not. Then issues the configure terminal command. It waits for the configuration prompt to be displayed, and then issues the first of the configuration lines that needs to be applied in order for the flow export to work. This is IP flow export, and I'm using version 5. It then waits for the configuration prompt again and issues the second of the 2 commands that need to be added to the configuration, which is IP flow export destination, followed by the IP address that the records are going to need to be sent to, followed by the UDP port, which in this case is 9996. Now, that server IP address was appended to this string. So what this has done is it's concatenated together IP flow export destination, the IP address, and the UDP port number. So that's what it sent out to the device. It waits for the configuration prompt to be displayed, and that's the end of it. So let me show you what happens at the port level. This is a little easier. On the port level, we first of all find out the name. That's the short name for the port, what it's going to be called. Then issue the configure terminal command. Wait for the prompt to come back. That's the configuration prompt. And then send the interface and the short identification for the interface. So if this were Ethernet 0, that would be interface space E0, because it will have looked up that short identifier right at the beginning. We then wait for the interface configuration prompt to come back. Now that's subtly different to the main configuration prompt, which is why it's using config if prompt instead of config prompt. And then we issue the command that's actually going to be added to the configuration for that interface in the config file, which is IP flow ingress. Finally, wait for that interface configuration prompt again, and that's the end of it. So let's see about this working. I'm going to show you what the config looks like at the moment on one of my routers. The interface configurations do not have the the flow export command in there, the flow ingress command. And if you look down at the IP section here, there's no mention of flow export. That's the device level configuration. Let's go into the Explorer, and rather than operating on a single device, I'm going to go straight to this view. I'm going to configure all three of my routers in one go. First of all, let's configure the device level settings. I've actually got these set up in a zone, and so it knows the IP address of the interface that it's connected to. It's actually my Ethernet interface. So I'm just going to leave it set to zone. I could have put in an IP address explicitly if I were not using zone configuration. So I'll say OK, and it's now done the job. If I go and set up the port level configuration, it didn't ask me for any information because it didn't need to know anything. It's just done that operation. And in fact, it worked on 9 out of 15 selected ports because the other ones were, 6 of those ports were virtual ports, which is why it skipped them. That was that filter configuration. Let's go in and see what it did. I'll go to that router, and I'm going to show the running configuration again. This time, what you're going to see is that at the interface level, we've added in the IP flow ingress command to each of the interface sections of the config. And if you look down at the IP section, there are 2 extra lines, the IP flow export version 5 and the IP flow export destination, and that was the network interface that it looked up automatically from my zone configuration, followed by the UDP port. So the routers are all configured for NetFlow, and the flows would now be being sent to my server. Let's look at the very last example that we're going to do today, and that is using configuration management not to make a change to a device configuration, but use it to gather some information from the command line that isn't necessarily available from SNMP. There are some pieces of information on certain makes and models of devices that are only available at the command line. You can't get it through SNMP MIBs. One that I've heard of is a specific VPN device that was licensed as to how many concurrent VPN tunnels it was allowed to support. The information about how many licenses are installed and how many are actually being used is only available at the command line, so we can't SNMP poll that. I'm going to show how to get information from the command line and put it into an attribute on the device. Now, I'm going to use these Cisco routers, and in fact what I'll do is use the show hardware command. So that, if I issue the show hardware command, it gives me back about 20 lines worth of information about the hardware on that device. I want to take all of that and put all of those lines into a text attribute associated with that device. So the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, I need to add a new attribute to put that information in. If I look at this particular device, go to the Advanced tab, you'll see that I've got an attribute here called Hardware Details. That's not part of your standard configuration. I added that, and it contains nothing at the moment. It's a blank string, but it is editable. I've allowed it to be edited. Now, this is important. In order for configuration management to be able to write into that attribute must be editable. Now, if you implement user-defined attributes through the user-defined polling configuration, they are not editable. Therefore, they can't be used for this purpose. So this is a standard object attribute. The way I implemented that was using an extra configuration file that I put into the etc directory. And by the way, I should have said this up front, everything I'm showing you is in a couple of application notes which we'll be emailing out. So all of this detail is in the application notes so that you can review it later. This is the configuration for this new attribute called hardware details. First of all, it extends the configuration for an extended device. It adds a new attribute. The adding is done with a plus equals. It then adds an attribute called hardware details, but you'll notice there's a tilde character before hardware details. That indicates that it is to be editable. If you didn't have the tilde, it would not be editable, which would defeat the object. Then define the hardware details attribute itself, which is going to be of type text, which is an arbitrary length text field, which is perfect for what we're doing here. We're going to call it hardware details, and that'll be how it's displayed. And finally, it's going to default to containing a blank string. In order to add that to the system, we modify the swsite-specific.cfg file. Again, that's in the etc directory. Add one line to it to cause that other file to be included, which would be exclamation mark, which is the include character, and then the name of that file we've just created, swdevicehardware.cfg. In order to have this configuration adopted, you need to shut your Intuity server down, rerun configure, and then bring it back up again. Then you'll be at the stage I'm at, where I've got the new attribute here, but it's empty. Let me show you how configuration management can be used to populate it. If I go to the configuration management menu, I'll show you a task that I've set up called Get Hardware Details. All it's got is the login. It calls the new step for getting the hardware details, and it logs out again. And there's nothing clever in the advanced section here as well, although I have set it up so that you can run it at the view level. I could have extended the selection limit had I wanted to. If you take a look at the steps, this is really the heart of the whole operation. Get hardware details is a step here. By the way, it doesn't have to be the same name. I just kept it the same between the task and the step just to make life easy. What this does is, first of all, check that it is a Cisco device, because this is Cisco's specific syntax I'm using. This could be implemented for any make and model of device, provided you can access it at the command line. Then it issues the show hardware command. So it's not going into the configuration mode. It's not doing a configure terminal, because we're not making a change to the configuration. We're just issuing the show hardware command. And now I'm setting up a string buffer. Now, this is all written in Groovy. Groovy is derived from Java. It's an extension of the Java language. A string buffer can hold a string. It's very similar to the concept of a string, but it is subtly different. And the reason I'm using a string buffer is that that is what the expect script actually is using itself. This attribute within the expect script is holding all of the text that has been received from the device until it sees this string. That's the prompt. So in other words, when you issue show hardware, all of the text that comes back is put into this variable called matched, and that is then being appended to the empty string buffer here, which means that once the prompt has been seen at the end of all of those lines, we've got all of those lines in one string buffer string. Now, the first line is actually the show hardware command. I don't want that command as part of my information that's going to be put in the attribute. That's not information that's returned. That's what I sent to it. So I want to get rid of the first line. And I also want to chop the last two lines off. One is a blank line, and the other one is the prompt itself. We don't need those. We don't want them in our attribute. So the way I've decided to do that is that I've broken up that multi-line content of the string buffer into a list of lines. Each element in the list is going to be a separate line described as a string, and that's how that's being done by this operation here. And I'm using a list because that allows me then to chop off the first line and chop off the last two lines. Nice and easy. And the very last thing that happens is, now that we've got all of that information in a form that's ready to be put into our attribute, these lines actually write that into the editable attribute that we set up. Quick note, it does need to specify the user account under whose authority this is being written in. Now, on a system that's using local authentication, the admin account defaults to user ID 3. That's why I put that in there. If you're using external authentication, you're going to need to use a different user ID number, and probably the best thing is, if you're going to do this, let us know, reach out to support, and we'll find your user ID of a suitable user for you that you can put in here. Then, when it comes to actually writing out to the attribute name is hardware details. That's the one we set up earlier. And it takes that list of lines and it then just joins them all back together again with new line characters in between each one to form a single string that is going to be written back. So that's what that syntax is all about there. So that's how it performs the write into the attribute. Let's actually make it so. I'm going to go back to the Explorer, and as I showed you earlier, this device has an empty content here. The Chicago router also is empty, and so is the San Fran router. I'm going to go straight to the view rather than operating on a single device, and I'm going to say gather the hardware details for all of these routers in that view. If I go to the device here, the first one, let's look in the Advanced tab. You're going to see that that information has been gathered. It's been put into that attribute. And if I were to click that, you'll see all of those lines. They're all separate lines here. And so that has been automatically put into the attribute. And the same applies to both of those other routers. That same information was gathered. It may be that you're actually going to be gathering information that changes over time. If you want to do that, then what you'd probably want to be doing is automating the running of those configuration management tasks. And you would do that using the task scheduler. Under the configuration management section, there is a tab here for scheduling, and that allows you to set up a new schedule. You would define which task it is, in this case, get hardware details. You would give it a description. You would assign it a view. If you wanted to restrict it to an individual device, you can do. And then you would pick your schedule, maybe hourly, daily, maybe every 5 minutes, whatever was needed to run it. So with that said, what I'm going to do is just point out a few additional bits of information that you may want to get hold of. First of all, anything to do with configuration management, you will find it available in the online help and in the PDF formatted guides that are provided within the system. In the online help, if you just type configuration management script, it will take you to the section which details all of the standard scripts that we provide and explains them line by line how they work. If you go to the System Administrator Guide, you'll find that in version 16.5, chapters 66 and 71 are particularly interesting and relevant to configuration management. And finally on here, the YouTube channel for Intuity has got previous tech talks, and the June 2017 tech talk was a particularly useful one where we talked about automating the launching of configuration management tasks as a result of the event management system raising an action. So if it decides that something needs to be done using configuration management, that can all be automated, and it tells you how to do that. One thing I will do at this point is just point out a little bit of extra information. Let me just show you again on here. The Groovy itself, which is the language which these scripts are written in, is a language that is looked after by the Apache Foundation. And if you were to go to groovy-lang.org, or just simply Google for Groovy, and you'll find it through there, then you'll find that you can download the complete distribution, and that allows you to be able to create your own scripts completely outside of Intuity and test out your syntax. So it provides the Groovy console, which allows you to punch in some lines of Groovy and then execute it and see the result, see whether it works and what the result was. So it's a really useful way of helping you when you're developing this type of operation. So, without further ado, let's move on to the question and answer session. Pat, do we have any questions?
Yes, we have one, JD, and it is, could you quickly review how you change an existing script?
Right, okay. First of all, when we're talking about an existing script, I'm assuming that the question here is related to one of the scripts or tasks that we provide as part of the standard configuration. Those would be the ones that would be listed as being system rather than custom. Now, system tasks and steps are read-only. They are deliberately read-only, and we deliberately prevent you from changing them, because were they to be changed when it comes to an upgrade, we would overwrite them with our standard versions, and that would wipe out all of your changes. That wouldn't be good. So what we do allow you to do is to copy existing tasks and steps and then rename those and edit them. Once they're copied, they are custom tasks and custom steps, and you can edit those. That's why we do it, to make sure that come an upgrade, we don't walk all over the work that you've put in to customize it. Is there anything else, Pat?
Thanks, JD. That's it.
Right. Okay. So it looks like that's it for the questions. However, do please feel free to use techtalks@intuity.com for any questions you have relating to this or any other tech talk. But also, please note, we are always looking for new topics to cover in future tech talks. What is interesting to you is important. So if you've got a topic that you would like us to cover in a tech talk, please let us know. The Training Academy is an important resource that Intuity has. A quick reminder, if you haven't signed up yet, that the Training Academy is available for your use and reference. Sign up today and take advantage of this portal. The sign-up form is found on intuity.com. If you look up in the menu section near the top, you'll find the login option. If you go in there, then it'll take you through to the training section, and you can set up your own account. We've got some other things going on. The last Tech Talk of 2017, yes, we're nearly at the end of the year, is going to be held on the 13th of December. And the topic is the Integrated Flow Analyzer and its Premium Edition. That's the Flow, NetFlow, SFlow, etc. reporting system. Now that you know how to configure your routers automatically, this will take you through how to use the flow reporting that's part of the system. So please make a note in your calendar. We hope you're going to attend, and invitations will be forthcoming as we get closer to the date. To wrap up, we'll send you a video link of today's presentation and those application notes that I mentioned earlier. If you have any questions about today's content or would like a personal demonstration, be sure to contact your Intuity system engineer. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending and hope to see you on December the 13th for the next Tech Talk. Have a good week.